Have you ever wondered how the largest aircraft carrier of the Second World War vanished into the abyss before it could even launch a single plane into battle? Most legends are born in the heat of combat, but the story of the IJN Shinano is a haunting tale of shadows, secrecy, and a catastrophic rush to change the course of a losing war. To the Japanese High Command, she was supposed to be the unsinkable fortress of the Pacific, a colossal steel sanctuary that would protect the remnants of their dying fleet from the American onslaught. But to those who walked her vast and unfinished decks, she was a hollow giant, a ship of ghosts built in absolute silence and shrouded in the desperation of an empire. The fascination with the Shinano lies in her monumental scale, a behemoth born from the hull of a Yamato-class battleship, yet destined to meet a lonely and silent end in the dark. My name is a whisper of the past now, but I remember the chilling atmosphere of November 1944, when the pride of Japan was secretly launched into a sea of destiny. The fascination with the Shinano began in the hidden dry docks of Yokosuka, where she was constructed behind massive curtains and under the threat of death for any who spoke her name. The psychological weight of her secrecy was immense, as even the sailors assigned to her didn't fully understand the true nature of the vessel they were about to board and serve. The secret flaw of her birth was the desperate haste of her conversion from a battleship to a carrier, a compromise of engineering forced by the devastating losses at the Battle of Midway. We saw a ship that looked invincible from the outside, with armor plating that could withstand the heaviest shells, yet her internal guts were a labyrinth of unsealed pipes and unfinished doors. The fascination of the crew was a mixture of awe and a deep, underlying anxiety, as we realized that the ship was being pushed into the ocean far before she was ready. We were sailing on a dream of imperial grandeur, but the physical reality beneath our feet was a ticking clock of structural vulnerabilities and incomplete safety systems. The psychological weight of the late war period was heavy in the air as we prepared for her maiden voyage, a journey that was supposed to be a simple transfer to a safer harbor. The fascination of her size was undeniable. She was over 800 feet of steel, a floating airfield that dwarfed every other ship in the Imperial Navy at the time. Yet, the secret flaw of our voyage was the inexperience of the crew, many of whom were raw recruits or survivors from other sunken ships who had never seen a carrier. We were moving under the cover of darkness to avoid the B-29 bombers, a silent flight from the encroaching shadows of the American air power that now dominated our home skies. The fascination of the mission was its absolute silence, as we were forbidden from using our radios or even showing a single flicker of light on the darkened and cold decks. We were a ghost ship moving through our own waters, a giant trying to remain invisible in an ocean that was increasingly controlled by the unseen eyes of the enemy. I remember the secret flaw of our escort, which consisted of only 3 destroyers, a pitifully small guard for a vessel of such immense strategic importance and symbolic value to the nation. The fascination of the Japanese strategy was its reliance on the darkness to hide our movements, a gamble that ignored the growing technological reach of the American submarine force. The psychological weight of the night was intense, as the lookouts strained their eyes against the black waves, looking for the telltale white wake of a torpedo in the water. We felt the vibration of the engines through the soles of our boots, a rhythmic thumping that seemed to echo the nervous beating of our own uncertain and heavy hearts. The fascination of the Shinano was her perceived invulnerability, a belief that her massive belt of armor could shrug off any weapon the Americans could throw at her hull. But armor is only as strong as the seals behind it, and we were sailing with doors that wouldn't close and pumps that hadn't been fully tested or verified. The psychological weight of the encounter began when a lone American submarine, the USS Archerfish, picked up our massive radar signature on the surface of the dark and rolling sea. The fascination of the chase was a classic game of predator and prey, but in this version the prey was a giant and the hunter was a tiny shadow in the deep. The secret flaw of our defense was a simple navigational error, a zigzag pattern that actually brought us closer to the submarine's wading tubes instead of leading us away. We didn't know we were being watched, didn't know that the largest prize in naval history was being lined up for a kill by a commander who couldn't believe his luck. The fascination of the moment was the silence of the ocean, a quiet that masked the frantic calculations happening inside the cramped and pressurized hull of the enemy submarine. We were a mountain of steel moving at 20 knots, believing in our own legend while the reality of our destruction was being loaded into the tubes. I often think about the secret flaw of the lookouts on that fateful night, whose vision was blurred by fatigue and the false sense of security provided by our escorting destroyers. The fascination of the radar technology was also our undoing, as the very signal meant to protect us became the beacon that led the hunter directly to our secret path. The psychological weight of the sudden alarm was a physical jolt, a scream through the ship that broke the silence and signaled the beginning of the end for the giant. We saw the streaks in the water, 4 white lines of death that seemed to move with an agonizing and predatory slowness toward our massive and unpainted side. The fascination of the impact was not a loud explosion, but a series of dull, heavy thuds that vibrated through the hundreds of feet of our armored and hollow hull. We didn't feel like we were sinking at first. We felt like a giant that had been poked by a needle, unaware that the needle was poisoned. The psychological weight of the damage was initially dismissed by the officers on the bridge, who trusted in the unsinkable design of the Yamato-class hull and its heavy plating. The fascination of the engineering was our curse, as the belief in the ship's invincibility led to a fatal delay in taking the necessary damage control measures to save her. The secret flaw was now bleeding us dry, as the torpedoes had struck in the worst possible locations, right where the battleship armor met the new carrier superstructure. The fascination of the water was its relentless nature, as it poured through the unfinished electrical conduits and the unsealed doors that our inexperienced crew couldn't manage to close. We were a masterpiece of naval architecture that was being defeated by a lack of simple rubber gaskets and the hubris of a command that refused to admit defeat. The ship began to take on a slight, almost imperceptible list, a subtle shift in the world that signaled the giant was starting to lose its balance. I remember the secret flaw of the pumps, which were designed for a battleship but couldn't handle the unique flooding patterns of an unfinished aircraft carrier's wide and open spaces. The fascination of the chaos was the way the crew reacted, a mix of frantic effort and paralyzed shock as the reality of our situation began to slowly sink in. The psychological weight of the darkness below the decks was terrifying, as the rising water extinguished the lights and left men trapped in a cold and metallic labyrinth of rising death. We heard the sound of the ocean rushing through the ship, a roar that drowned out the orders and the screams of the men who were trying to save their home. The fascination of the Shinano was turning into a nightmare of iron and salt, a tragedy of scale where the very size of the ship made it impossible to control. We were losing the battle against the sea, not because of a grand fleet engagement, but because of 4 holes and 1,000 unfinished and neglected details. The fascination with the ship's final hours was a slow-motion descent into despair. As the list increased, and the giant carrier began to feel heavy and sluggish in the water. The psychological weight of the Yamato spirit was the only thing keeping some men at their posts, even as the water reached their waists in the dark and oily engine rooms. The secret flaw was the realization that no amount of courage could overcome the laws of buoyancy and the catastrophic failure of our hurried and desperate shipboard construction. We watched as the escorting destroyers circled us, their crews looking up at our massive hull with a look of horror and disbelief at the sight of our slow collapse. The fascination of the night had turned into the cold gray light of dawn, revealing the Shinano as a wounded beast, leaning heavily toward the sea that was claiming her. We were the witnesses to the death of a dream, a colossal secret that was being revealed to the world only at the very moment of its final and total disappearance. This was the state of the IJN Shinano as she reached the point of no return, a giant carrier that had existed for only 10 days and was now a tomb for her crew. The fascination of her story is the tragedy of wasted potential and the arrogance of a leadership that thought they could cheat the realities of naval warfare with size. The psychological weight of the sinking was a blow to the heart of the Japanese Navy, a secret shame that they tried to hide even as the giant vanished. The secret flaw of the Shinano was that she was a ship built for a war that was already lost, a relic of a past era trying to survive in a future she wasn't ready for. We prepared to abandon ship, but the fascination of the giant remained, a feeling that even in death, she was the most impressive thing we had ever seen. The ocean was waiting for her, and the history books were waiting to turn her into the world's largest and most tragic naval ghost ship. The fascination with the IJN Shinano's interior was a descent into a mechanical nightmare where the air felt thick with the smell of wet iron and cold, stagnant seawater. The psychological weight of the flooding was magnified by the sheer scale of the hangar decks, which acted like a massive playground for the incoming and violent waves. The secret flaw of the conversion was the lack of transverse bulkheads in the upper levels, allowing the water to rush from one side to the other without any resistance. We felt the giant ship lurch with every heave of the ocean, a sickening movement that signaled the loss of our primary and vital stability on the surface. The fascination of the crew was replaced by a frantic, disorganized energy as sailors tried to plug massive leaks with nothing but blankets and wooden planks. We were fighting a losing battle against the laws of physics, trapped inside a steel mountain that was slowly forgetting how to stay upright in the deep. The psychological weight of the darkness was a silent predator, as the failing generators cast long, flickering shadows across the faces of men who were losing their hope. I remember the secret flaw of the command structure, where the officers and the civilian technicians from the shipyard argued over the controls while the water continued to rise. The fascination of the bureaucratic failure was a tragic irony, as the men who built the ship couldn't agree on how to save it during its first and only crisis. The psychological weight of the indecision was felt in every compartment, as orders were given and then immediately rescinded by a leadership that was paralyzed by the shock. We watched as the water reached the electrical switchboards, causing sparks to fly like dying stars in the gloom of the lower and increasingly flooded engine rooms. The fascination of the engineering was our curse, as the complex systems required for a ship of this size were now becoming traps for the men inside. We were a crew of nearly 2,000, yet we felt like lonely individuals lost in a maze of metal that was being reclaimed by the salt. The ship was a masterpiece of secrets, but her biggest secret was that she was never truly a ship, only a collection of unfinished parts. The psychological weight of the Yamato spirit began to crack as the list reached 10 degrees, a point where walking on the decks became a struggle against a steep and slippery slope. The fascination of the sailors' discipline was tested by the sight of oil-slicked water pouring out of the ventilation shafts, a sign that the flooding was far deeper than reported. The secret flaw was the failure of the armored belt to stay watertight, as the force of the torpedoes had bent the massive plates and broken the vital and fragile seals. We tried to form bucket brigades, a desperate and primitive response to a modern catastrophe that showed just how poorly prepared we were for a real and lethal engagement. The fascination of the scene was its futility, a few hundred men trying to empty an ocean from a vessel that was built to carry 70,000 tons of steel. We felt the psychological weight of the failure of the Empire, as the unsinkable carrier proved to be as fragile as a paper boat in a winter storm. Every groan of the hull was a reminder that the ocean does not care about the name or the size of the ship it is currently devouring. I often think about the secret flaw of the hull's center of gravity, which had been dangerously altered by the addition of the massive and heavy flight deck on top of the battleship base. The fascination of the architecture was its undoing, as the ship was now top-heavy and prone to a sudden and catastrophic capsize if the flooding wasn't perfectly balanced. The psychological weight of the list was a constant pressure on our equilibrium, making every movement a calculated risk of falling into the dark and rising waters below. We saw the destroyers, Isokaze and Hamakaze, drawing closer, their masts leaning as they struggled to stay alongside our massive and tilting side to offer any kind of help. The fascination of the perspective was terrifying. From their decks, we must have looked like a dying whale, a giant that had lost its strength and was waiting for the end. We were the pride of Yokosuka, the secret weapon of the Emperor, and yet we were being defeated by the very water we were supposed to rule. The ship was a hollow shell of its former glory, a ghost that was already half submerged in the cold and indifferent Pacific. The fascination with the ship's secret flaw extended to the medical bay where the wounded were being treated in a room that was now tilted at a sharp and impossible angle. The psychological weight of the medical staff's struggle was a silent tragedy, as they fought to keep their equipment from sliding across the blood-stained and metal floors. We heard the screams of men trapped behind jammed doors, their voices echoing through the ship like the cries of the damned in an iron and salt-filled purgatory. The fascination of the human spirit was still there, but it was being crushed by the weight of the steel and the cold reality of the rising and oily tide. We were a ship of secrets, but the greatest secret was the one the officers wouldn't say, that the Shinano was a dead ship walking the sea. Every minute that passed brought us closer to the final plunge, yet we continued to work, driven by a mechanical duty that had lost its purpose. We were the crew of the world's largest ghost, sailing toward a destination that was not on any map of the living or the dead. I remember the secret flaw of the ship's stability tanks, which were supposed to be the final line of defense, but were now inaccessible due to the rapid and uneven flooding. The fascination of the mechanical failure was a testament to the haste of our departure, as the valves had never been properly lubricated or tested for such a crisis. The psychological weight of the helplessness was absolute, as we stood in the darkness and listened to the ocean claim another compartment with a dull and heavy roar. We watched as the list increased to 15 degrees, a point of no return that made the vast and empty hangar deck look like a slide into the abyss. The fascination of the scale was our nightmare. There was too much ship to save and not enough time to find the leaks in the labyrinth of the hull. We were a collective of 2,000 souls, but we were being silenced by the weight of a 70,000-ton mistake that was dragging us down. The Shinano was a dream that had turned into a nightmare of iron, salt, and the crushing pressure of the deep and dark ocean. The psychological weight of the silence from the engine rooms was the final blow to our morale, as the boilers were extinguished by the rising and cold seawater. The fascination of the sudden stillness was eerie, as the vibrations that had defined our world for 10 days finally stopped and left us in a void. The secret flaw of our propulsion was its vulnerability to the flooding, a design that assumed the ship would always remain on an even and steady keel in battle. Without power, we had no lights, no pumps, and no hope of steering the giant away from the path of her inevitable and tragic destruction. The fascination of the darkness was a physical presence, a cold and heavy blanket that wrapped around us as we felt the ship lose its final forward momentum. We were a drifting mountain of steel, a silent monument to a war that was already lost, floating in the dark and waiting for the sea. The Shinano was no longer a warship. She was a sinking island, a piece of Japan that was returning to the bottom of the world. I often think about the secret flaw of the ship's survival equipment, as the lifeboats were bolted to the deck and could not be released at the extreme and sharp angle. The fascination of the failure was a grim irony. The ship that was designed to be a sanctuary was now a trap that refused to let us go. The psychological weight of the realization was a wave of panic that began to spread through the lower decks as men fought to reach the upper and open air. We saw the vast hangar deck filling with water, the Hinamaru painted on the deck now disappearing beneath a layer of black oil and salty and cold foam. The fascination of the sight was the end of an empire's ambition, the largest carrier in the world being conquered by a few tons of water. We were the ghosts of the Shinano, the men who would carry the secret of her final and lonely hours into the silence of the after. The giant was leaning, her flight deck nearly touching the waves, a queen of the sea who was finally bowing to the power of the deep. The fascination with the secret flaw of the final hour was the total lack of a plan for abandonment, a chaos that cost the lives of over 1,000 brave and loyal men. The psychological weight of the shouting and the screaming was a cacophony of despair that replaced the orderly discipline of the Imperial Japanese Navy's proud and long tradition. We watched as men jumped into the freezing water, only to be pulled back toward the ship by the massive and powerful suction of the sinking and heavy hull. The fascination of the giant's death was a terrifying spectacle, as the Shinano began to roll onto her side, exposing her massive and red-painted belly to the light. We were the witnesses to a catastrophe of monumental proportions, a secret that was being buried in the sand of the ocean floor where it belonged. The ship was a ghost, a legend that had lasted only 10 days, but the weight of those 10 days would stay with us for a lifetime. We prepared for the final plunge, a journey into the dark where the largest ship in the world was waiting for her final rest. As the list reached 30 degrees, the fascination with the ship's survival was gone, replaced by the primitive and animalistic urge to escape the iron and salt tomb. The psychological weight of the moment was a heavy and crushing thing, as the world turned sideways and the sky became a distant and unreachable and beautiful dream. The secret flaw of the Shinano was her final act. She was a ship that was built to be a fortress, but she ended as a cage for the very men she was meant to protect. We felt the giant move, a slow and majestic roll that signaled the end of our struggle and the beginning of her eternal and silent and dark sleep. The fascination of the sinking was a roar of air and a rush of water, a sound that would haunt our dreams long after the war was over and done. The Shinano was a giant, a ghost, and a tragedy, a secret that was finally being given back to the ocean from which it had been so desperately and proudly born. We were the survivors, the ones who had to tell the story of the carrier that never was, and the giant that died in the dark. The fascination with the IJN Shinano's hangar deck turned into a scene of pure industrial horror as the vast space became a trap for thousands of tons of loose water. The psychological weight of the internal tide was immense as the sloshing sea smashed into the unanchored equipment and the crates of supplies that were never properly secured. The secret flaw of our preparation was the absence of internal partitions, which allowed the weight of the water to shift violently with every single roll of the dying ship. We heard the thunderous sound of heavy steel moving across the deck, a chaotic and lethal music that signaled the total loss of our remaining and fragile equilibrium. The fascination of the carnage was a grim sight to behold, as men were crushed by the very cargo they had worked so hard to bring on board the giant. We were no longer in control of our environment. We were merely insects, clinging to a sliding floor in a world that had turned into a dark and wet machine. The psychological weight of the air grew thin as the ventilation failed, leaving us with nothing but the smell of fear, salt, and the leaking and toxic fuel. I remember the secret flaw of the ship's communication wires, which were not insulated against the seawater and shorted out, leaving the bridge completely blind to the lower decks. The fascination of the isolation was a specialized terror, as each compartment became its own small and lonely world of rising water and cold, dark, and heavy silence. The psychological weight of not knowing if the rest of the crew was still alive or already drowned was a burden that made every second feel like a lifetime. We saw officers trying to use handheld lanterns to find their way through the smoke and the spray, their faces pale reflections of the imperial glory they once represented. The fascination of the engineering was our enemy, as the complicated layout of the battleship hull made finding an exit an almost impossible task for the panicked recruits. We were a collective of ghosts wandering through a steel labyrinth that was slowly filling with the cold and indifferent embrace of the deep and dark Pacific Ocean. Every step we took was a struggle against the gravity of the list, a steep climb toward a sky that we could no longer see or feel from below. The psychological weight of the death roll began as the list surpassed 40 degrees, making it impossible for the human body to maintain any footing on the metal. The fascination of the perspective was a distortion of reality, as the walls became floors and the pipes overhead became obstacles to our desperate and frantic escape. The secret flaw of the carrier's wide beam was that once it tipped past a certain point, the massive weight of the flight deck acted as a lever to pull it down. We felt the giant groan as the center of gravity finally failed, a sickening and slow movement that felt like the Earth itself was turning over to sleep. The fascination of the sound was a chorus of snapping rivets and bending beams, the agony of a 70,000-ton machine being torn apart by the weight of its own ambition. We were sliding toward the port side, a human avalanche of sailors and equipment falling into the dark and oily water that was already claiming the hangar. The psychological weight of the moment was a scream that had no voice, a silent realization that the unsinkable fortress was about to become our permanent and cold tomb. I often think about the secret flaw of the emergency lighting, which flickered one last time and then died forever, plunging the interior of the ship into a total and absolute blackness. The fascination of the dark was its weight. It felt like a physical substance that pressed against our eyes and made the rising water feel even colder and more lethal. The psychological weight of being trapped in the dark while the world turned sideways is a terror that no man can truly ever describe or forget. We felt the cold touch of the sea on our legs, a rising tide that carried the smell of the depths and the metallic tang of the ship's own lifeblood. The fascination of the struggle was the sound of hands clawing at the steel, the desperate search for a hatch or a ladder that would lead to the open and free air. We were the crew of the world's largest secret, But in the dark, we were just frightened animals fighting for a single breath of the toxic and diesel-filled air. The Shinano was no longer a ship of war. She was a sinking mountain of iron that was dragging us down into the silence of the after. The fascination with the secret flaw of the ship's massive propellers was revealed as the list exposed them to the air, their blades still spinning with a useless and terrifying force. The psychological weight of the sight was a nightmare for the men in the water, who feared being pulled into the churning vortex created by the giant's death throes. We saw the destroyers back away to avoid the suction, their crews watching in a state of paralyzed shock as the pride of the Navy began its final and fatal roll. The fascination of the scale was never more apparent than in those last minutes, as the vast flight deck stood nearly vertical against the gray and cold morning sky. We were witnesses to the end of an era, a monument to a misguided and desperate strategy that had cost the lives of thousands of our brothers. The psychological weight of the failure was a crushing thing, as we realized that the grand old lady of Yokosuka was nothing but a hollow and tragic ghost. Every minute brought us closer to the final plunge, the moment when the ocean would finally claim its prize and hide our shame forever. I remember the secret flaw of the life jackets, which were stored in lockers that were now underwater or jammed shut by the extreme and sharp angle of the ship. The fascination of the desperation was a cold reality, as men fought over pieces of wood and empty crates to keep themselves afloat in the freezing and oily waves. The psychological weight of seeing your friends disappear into the black water was a blow to the heart that no training could ever prepare a man to survive. We watched as the Hinomaru on the deck was slowly swallowed by the sea, the red sun of Japan disappearing beneath the gray and cold surface of the water. The fascination of the tragedy was its silence. There was no glory, no battle cry, only the muffled roar of air escaping from the wounded and sinking hull. We were the survivors of a ship that never fought, the crew of a ghost that was returning to the shadows before it could ever see the light. The Shinano was a giant, but she was a giant with feet of clay, a secret that was being buried in the sand of the deep. The psychological weight of the suction was a physical force that pulled at our bodies as the Shinano finally reached the point of no return and began her final dive. The fascination of the physics was a terrifying thing to experience, the feeling of a mountain moving through the water and dragging everything with it into the abyss. The secret flaw of our escape was the timing. We had stayed too long trying to save a ship that was already dead, and now we were paying the price. We felt the rush of the water as the giant rolled completely over, her massive red belly facing the sky like a dead and bloated whale in the sea. The fascination of the sight was the final insult to the Imperial Navy, a symbol of their total and utter defeat at the hands of a superior and invisible foe. We were the ghosts of the deep now, struggling to break free from the grip of the iron and salt that wanted to keep us forever. The Shinano was going down, and she was taking the dreams of an empire with her into the cold and dark and silent night. I often think about the secret flaw of the ship's secret identity, as the world would not even know she existed until years after the war had finally come to an end. The fascination of her invisibility was her greatest tragedy. She died in the dark, a secret that was never shared and a glory that was never truly earned. The psychological weight of that anonymity was a heavy thing for the survivors, who were ordered to remain silent about the loss of the giant. We were the guardians of a ghost, the keepers of a story that the High Command wanted to erase from the records of the great and terrible war. The fascination of the silent carrier was a burden of shame that we carried into the post-war years, a memory of a 10-day journey that ended in disaster. We saw the ocean close over the last piece of the hull, a final ripple in the water that marked the spot where the largest carrier in the world lay. The Shinano was gone, a secret buried under miles of water, a giant that had lived only long enough to die in the dark. The fascination with the secret flaw of the final minutes was the total collapse of the ship's internal structure, as the water pressure crushed the air-filled and hollow compartments below. The psychological weight of the sound was a series of muffled thuds and groans that vibrated through the water and into our very bones as we swam away. We felt the shock waves of the implosions, a reminder of the power of the deep and the fragility of the machines that we build to defy it. The fascination of the destruction was absolute. The largest ship in the world was being dismantled by the simple and relentless weight of the ocean it tried to rule. We were the witnesses to a catastrophe that was both monumental and strangely quiet. A tragedy of scale that had no witness but the sea and the sky. The Shinano was a ghost, a legend that was born in secrecy and died in silence, a giant that was conquered by a few tons of water. We were the survivors, the ones who had to live with the secret of the giant that vanished before it could ever truly begin. As the last of the Shinano disappeared beneath the waves, the fascination with her survival was replaced by the cold and hard reality of our own survival in the water. The psychological weight of the losses was evident in the empty sea around us, where only a few hundred men out of 2,000 were still afloat. The secret flaw of the entire mission was revealed in that moment. We had risked everything for a ship that was not ready, for a cause that was already lost in the dark. We watched the sun rise over the empty horizon, a beautiful and indifferent light that shone on the spot where the giant had just been. The fascination of the ocean was its ability to forget, to smooth over the surface as if nothing had ever happened in the hundreds of feet of depth below. We were the ghosts of the Shinano, the men who would carry the weight of her secret into a future that she would never be a part of. The giant was at rest, a secret buried in the sand of the deep, a tragedy that would haunt the history of the sea forever. The fascination with the empty space where the IJN Shinano had just been was a psychological blow that felt like the world had been hollowed out. The psychological weight of the silence following the massive roar of her sinking was a deafening vacuum that left us floating in a daze of oil and salt. The secret flaw of the rescue was the fear of the escorting destroyers, who remained wary that the American submarine was still lingering in the shadows for another kill. We watched as the Isokaze and Hamikaze moved cautiously through the debris, their searchlights cutting through the gray morning mist like cold and judging eyes from above. The fascination of the survivors was our shared anonymity, as we huddled together in the freezing water, covered in the black lifeblood of the giant that had failed us. Every man was a ghost, stripped of rank and purpose, waiting to see if the Empire would even bother to pull its secret sailors from the deep. The psychological weight of the cold began to take hold, a slow and numbing reminder that the ocean was now the only master of the Pacific. I remember the secret flaw of the debris field, which was filled with jagged pieces of the unfinished flight deck that became lethal weapons in the rolling and heavy waves. The fascination of the carnage was a grim sight, as sailors clung to wooden planks that were never meant to be life rafts for a 70,000-ton catastrophe. The psychological weight of seeing the Hinomaru flags floating face down in the black oil was a symbolic end to the pride we had felt in Yokosuka. We heard the muffled cries of men who were being pulled under by the weight of their own waterlogged uniforms and the heavy, oil-soaked boots of the Navy. The fascination of the struggle was the raw, animalistic desperation to reach the nets of the destroyers before the cold or the suction claimed our tired bodies. We were the remnants of a secret weapon that had exploded in the hands of its creators, a tragedy of scale that had no witness. The ship was gone, but the weight of her steel seemed to still be pulling at our legs from the dark and lightless abyss. The psychological weight of the secret flaw in our training became evident as the rescue ship struggled to organize the massive number of men in the water. The fascination of the chaos was the lack of coordination, as the destroyers were overwhelmed by the sight of hundreds of oil-slicked faces screaming for help. We saw sailors slipping through the fingers of their rescuers, their hands too coated in the Shinano's fuel to hold onto the ropes or the nets. The fascination of the tragedy was the selective nature of survival, where luck and a strong grip were the only things that separated life from the end. We felt the psychological weight of the shame as we realized that over 1,000 of our brothers were still trapped in the Iron Mountain below. The ocean was a vast and indifferent mirror, reflecting the failure of a strategy that had placed all its hopes on a single, unfinished giant. We were the survivors of a ghost, and the secret of our defeat was already beginning to be suppressed by the officers on the decks. I often think about the secret flaw of the survivors' debriefing, where we were told that the Shinano never existed, and that her loss was a state secret. The fascination of our forced silence was a psychological cage, a command to forget the most significant and terrifying event of our young and violent lives. The psychological weight of carrying a memory that the world denied was a burden that turned us into ghosts long before we ever left the service. We were the crew of a ship that was a myth, a colossal mistake that the High Command wanted to erase from the scrolls of history. The fascination of the invisible carrier was the ultimate irony. She was too large to be hidden, yet the Empire insisted she had never even been built. We saw the sun fully rise over the empty sea, a beautiful and cruel light that showed no trace of the 70,000 tons of steel. The Shinano was a secret in life, and in death she was becoming a shadow that only the survivors were allowed to see. The fascination with the secret flaw of the ship's sinking was the realization that a single American submarine had destroyed the ultimate symbol of Japanese naval power. The psychological weight of that imbalance, a small boat against the largest carrier ever built, was a blow to the very core of our military and national pride. We realized then that the war was not just being lost on the front lines, but in the very labs and shipyards of our enemies. The fascination of the Davi and Goliath encounter was a recurring theme of the Pacific, but nowhere was it as stark or as tragic as here. We were the witnesses to a technological and strategic collapse that would haunt the future of our nation for many decades to come. The psychological weight of the Archerfish and its 6 torpedoes was the final proof that the era of the massive battleship hull was over. The Shinano was a dinosaur, a relic of a past that couldn't survive the cold and precise reality of the modern underwater hunt. I remember the secret flaw of the oil that covered us, which burned our eyes and filled our lungs with a toxic and chemical bitterness that never left. The fascination of the physical toll was the way the black sludge acted as a second skin, a mark of the Shinano that we couldn't wash away. The psychological weight of the scent, the smell of the ship's own death, remained in our nostrils for years after the war had finally reached its end. We were the Black Sailors, a group of men marked by the failure of the giant, living reminders of a 10-day journey into the dark. The fascination of the recovery was the quietness of the hospital ships, where no one spoke of the name of the ship that had wounded us. We were treated for burns and exhaustion, but there was no medicine for the secret we were ordered to keep deep inside our souls. The Shinano was a ghost that haunted our every breath, a tragedy of scale that was being buried under the weight of propaganda. The psychological weight of the secret flaw in our records was that many of us were listed as having served on other vessels to hide the loss. The fascination of the administrative lie was a testament to the desperation of a high command that could no longer face the truth of the war. We were men without a home, sailors of a ship that was a blank space in the ledger of the Imperial Japanese Navy's final and dark months. The fascination of the anonymity was a special kind of isolation, a feeling that our sacrifices and our fears didn't actually matter to the state. We were just cogs in a machine that was being dismantled by a superior force, a collection of souls lost in the gears of history. The Shinano was a ghost, and we were the haunted, carrying the weight of a 70,000-ton secret through the burning streets of a dying empire. Our war was a series of shadows, and the largest shadow of all was the one that lay at the bottom of the sea. I often think about the secret flaw of the shipyard workers in Yokosuka, who had poured their lives into the giant only to see her vanish. The fascination of their grief was never officially recorded, but the rumors of the sinking spread through the docks like a cold and biting winter wind. The psychological weight of the wasted effort was a silent tragedy that broke the hearts of the men and women who had built the fortress. They had been told that the Shinano would save Japan, that her wings would clear the skies of the B-29s and bring a new dawn. The fascination of the broken promise was a heavy thing, a realization that all the secrecy and all the labor had been for absolutely nothing. We were the lucky ones who survived the water, but they were the ones who had to live with the empty dry dock and the shame. The Shinano was a secret that had failed everyone, from the admirals in Tokyo to the laborers who hammered the final rivets. The fascination with the secret flaw of the ocean floor is that it holds the only true and honest record of what happened to the giant. The psychological weight of the wreckage miles below the surface is a silent testament to the scale of the human and industrial and naval folly. We imagine the Shinano lying there in the dark, her massive flight deck crushed by the pressure and her secrets finally revealed to the fish. The fascination of her final resting place is its peace, a quiet that she never knew during her 10 days of frantic and hurried life. We are the only ones who can still feel the vibration of her engines and the tilt of her deck in our very bones. The psychological weight of the history is a burden we share with the sea, a story that is etched into the sand and the salt. The Shinano was a ghost, a legend born in shadows and buried in the deep, a giant that was too heavy for the world. As the years pass, the fascination with the secret flaw of the Shinano remains a mystery that still draws the curious and the historians to the coast. The psychological weight of the story is its tragedy. The largest carrier in the world, lost to a single submarine before she could ever fight. We are the last of her crew, the guardians of a ghost that the world finally allowed itself to acknowledge after the war ended. The fascination of the giant is her silence, a reminder that the biggest secrets are often the ones that sink the fastest and the deepest. We look at the ocean and we see her still, a shadow on the horizon that never quite reaches the safety of the port. The psychological weight of the memory is a light that never goes out, a fire that burns in the dark and cold and silent night. The Shinano was our ship, our secret, and our tragedy, and her story will sail on as long as there is salt in the sea. The fascination with the final plunge was a sound that no man who heard it could ever truly purge from his soul or his memory. The psychological weight of the air escaping the massive hollow compartments created a roar that sounded like the very earth was being torn apart. The secret flaw of her gargantuan size was the violent suction she created as she surrendered her immense volume to the cold and dark depths. We saw men who had successfully jumped clear being pulled back toward the vortex, their arms flailing against the irresistible and powerful pull of the sinking iron. The fascination of the tragedy was the sight of the giant's 4 massive propellers rising high into the morning air like the limbs of a dying beast. We felt the pressure waves in the water, a series of rhythmic thuds as the internal bulkheads collapsed under the weight of the crushing Pacific. The psychological weight of the moment was a total and absolute realization that the greatest ship in the world was now just a memory. The Shinano was no longer a vessel of the living. She was a plummeting tomb of steel, oil, and 1,000 lost imperial dreams. I remember the secret flaw of the rescue nets on the destroyers, which became clogged with the thick black bunker oil that bled from the giant's ruptured heart. The fascination of the struggle was the desperate strength required to climb those ropes when your body was slicked with a lubricant that defied every grip. The psychological weight of watching a comrade's hands slide off the hemp was a horror that broke the spirit of those watching from the safety of the deck. We saw the Isokazi lurching in the swell, its sailors reaching down with poles and gaffs to snag the drifting and oil-blinded survivors of the carrier. The fascination of the scene was its frantic, silent intensity, as everyone knew that the American submarine might still be watching through a cold and hidden periscope. We were being pulled from the water like discarded refuse, a shattered remnants of a secret that the High Command was already preparing to deny. The psychological weight of the shame was as cold as the seawater, a feeling that we had failed the Emperor and the ancestors by surviving. The psychological weight of the secret flaw in our evacuation was the abandonment of the lower deck engineers who had stayed at their posts until the very end. The fascination of their loyalty was a haunting thought, knowing they were still inside that iron mountain as it began its miles-long descent to the floor. We imagined the final moments in the engine rooms, the lights flickering out as the ocean crushed the steel, and the silence of the deep moved in. The fascination of the sacrifice was a cornerstone of our naval tradition, yet in the cold light of day, it felt like a senseless and tragic waste of life. We were the lucky ones on the surface, but we carried the weight of those who were now part of the wreckage in the dark and silent abyss. The secret flaw of the Shinano was that she demanded a price in blood that her 10-day life could never truly justify or repay to the nation. We were a crew of ghosts, haunted by the faces of those we couldn't reach and the screams that were silenced by the salt and the pressure. I often think about the secret flaw of the ship's cargo, which included secret suicide Oka rocket bombs that were now sinking alongside the men they were meant to kill. The fascination of the irony was not lost on us. The weapons of death were being buried by the very ship that was supposed to deliver them. The psychological weight of the wasted technology was a symbol of the entire Japanese war effort in those final, desperate and dark months of the conflict. We were a nation of secrets and shadows, building machines of destruction that were being conquered by the simple and relentless reality of the sea. The fascination of the sinking was the end of a grand illusion, the belief that size and secrecy could overcome the industrial and naval might of the enemy. We watched the last ripples of the Shinano vanish, leaving only a few floating crates and the black stain of oil on the surface of the water. The psychological weight of the empty horizon was a physical pressure, a reminder that the world had moved on while the giant had stayed behind. The fascination with this secret flaw of our invisibility was that even the escorting destroyers seemed eager to leave the site of the disaster as quickly as possible. The psychological weight of the haste was a clear signal that the mission had been a failure, that the High Command wanted to forget immediately. We were crowded onto the narrow decks of the Hamikaze, shivering under thin blankets and drinking bitter tea that tasted of salt and the oil of the ship. The fascination of the quietness was absolute, as no one dared to speak the name of the Shinano or ask about the fate of the many missing. We were the keepers of a secret that was being suppressed even as we breathed, a tragedy that was being edited out of the official history. The psychological weight of the anonymity made us feel like we had never even existed, like the 10 days on the giant were just a fever dream of iron. We were the sailors of a ghost ship, and our only reward for our survival was a command to remain silent and disappear into the night. I remember the secret flaw of the hospital in Sasebo, where we were kept in isolation to ensure that no word of the carrier's loss would reach the civilian public. The fascination of the secrecy was a cage of walls and guards, a place where we were treated for our wounds but denied our own names. The psychological weight of the confinement was a special kind of torture, as we lived in a limbo of uncertainty about our future and our past. We saw the faces of the doctors, which were masks of professional indifference that hid the shock they must have felt at the scale of our injuries. The fascination of the silent ward was the way we looked at each other, a shared understanding of a tragedy that no one else was allowed to know. We were the victims of the Shinano's secret, the men who had been burned by her oil and broken by her fall, yet we were forbidden to mourn. The psychological weight of the suppressed grief was a slow poison that seeped into our hearts and stayed there for the rest of our lives. The psychological weight of the secret flaw in our reassignment was that we were scattered to the four winds, sent to small coastal units or the infantry. The fascination of the dispersal was a deliberate attempt to break the bond of the survivors and ensure the secret died with the end of the war. We were no longer a crew, just individual men carrying a heavy and dark secret through the ruins of a country that was being bombed into dust. The fascination of the irony was that the Shinano was supposed to protect these very cities, yet she lay at the bottom of the ocean, useless and cold. We saw the B-29s overhead and we thought of the empty flight deck that would never launch a single fighter to stop the burning of our homes. The psychological weight of the helplessness was a constant companion, a reminder of the giant that had failed us when we needed her the most. We were the survivors of a myth, and the reality of our defeat was written in the fire of the sky and the salt of the sea. I often think about the secret flaw of the imperial propaganda, which continued to speak of unsinkable fortresses while we knew the truth of the iron and the salt. The fascination of the lie was its persistence, a dream that the nation clung to even as the water reached the very throat of the empire. The psychological weight of the truth was a heavy and lonely burden, a secret that made us feel like strangers in our own land and among our own people. We were the ones who had seen the giant roll over, the ones who had felt the suction and heard the rivets pop in the deep and dark. The fascination of the grand illusion was a tragedy that was being repeated in every shipyard and every bunker across the Japanese islands in the final days. We were the ghosts of the Shinano, and the secret of her failure was the secret of the entire war, a struggle against an inevitable and crushing and powerful end. The giant was a symbol of our ambition, and her sinking was the prophecy of our final and total national collapse. The fascination with the secret flaw of the ocean's memory is that it does not care about the lies of men or the secrets of a high and desperate command. The psychological weight of the wreck of the Shinano is its honesty, a physical fact that remains unchanged by the passing of the years or the changing of the guard. We imagine the silt settling on the flight deck, the rust eating away at the Hinamaru, and the deep-sea currents moving through the silent and empty hangars. The fascination of her final state is a peace that we will never know, a quiet that is the only appropriate end for a ship born in such chaos. We are the last link to that 10-day journey, the only ones who can still feel the vibration of the boilers before they were extinguished by the sea. The psychological weight of the history is a light that shines on the truth of our folly and the scale of our tragic and monumental naval failure. The Shinano was a giant, and her grave is as vast and as lonely as the secret she tried to keep from the world. As the war finally reached its bitter and nuclear end, the fascination with the secret flaw of the Shinano was finally allowed to emerge from the shadows of history. The psychological weight of the revelation was a shock to a world that had no idea such a massive vessel had even been built or lost in the dark. We were the ones who finally spoke her name, who told the story of the 4 torpedoes and the 10 days of life on the Steel Mountain. The fascination of the largest ghost became a staple of naval lore, a story of secrecy and tragedy that captured the imagination of the former enemies who had hunted us. We looked at the photos of the Archerfish, and we saw the men who had ended our dream, realizing they were just sailors like us, doing their duty in the deep. The psychological weight of the memory is now a part of the history of the Pacific, a story of a ship that was too big for her time and too secret for her own good. The Shinano is at rest, and we are finally free to tell the truth of her end. The fascination with the legacy of the IJN Shinano is the profound silence she left behind, a void in the history of naval warfare that was only filled decades later. The psychological weight of the giant that never was remains a cautionary tale about the limits of engineering when it is stripped of time, testing, and the human element. The secret flaw of her story was not just the torpedoes or the unsealed doors, but the desperate belief that a single machine could alter the tide of an inevitable defeat. We look back at the 10-day life of this steel titan and see a mirror of the empire itself. Majestic on the outside, but hollow and unfinished within, rushing toward a fate it could not outrun. The fascination of the Shinano is her status as the ultimate ghost ship, a vessel that achieved immortality not through battle, but through the sheer magnitude of her tragic and lonely disappearance. We were the crew of a myth, and even as the world moved into the atomic age, the weight of her 70,000-ton memory stayed anchored in our souls. The giant is at rest now, a dark mountain of iron on the seabed, finally free from the secrets and the lies that defined her brief and violent time in the light. The psychological weight of the secret flaw in our national memory was the struggle to reconcile the pride of building such a ship with the shame of losing her so quickly. The fascination of the Shinano today is found in the blueprints and the blurry photographs that are all that remain of the world's largest aircraft carrier of that era. We see the lines of the Yamato-class hull, and we wonder what she might have been if the war had been different or if the divine wind had actually blown in her favor. But history is written in the salt and the rust, and the reality of the Shinano is a story of 4 holes and a long, slow descent into the crushing pressure of the deep. The fascination of her end is the realization that size is no defense against a determined enemy and a well-placed weapon from a hidden and silent hunter. We carry the memory of the vibrations, the smell of the oil, and the tilt of the deck as a sacred trust for those who were lost in her dark hangars. The ship was a secret in life, but in the annals of naval history, she has become a loud and echoing warning about the price of hubris. I remember the secret flaw of the first time the American public heard the name Shinano, long after the fires of the war had been extinguished by the peace of 1945. The fascination of the world was absolute, as they couldn't believe a ship of that magnitude could be kept hidden for so long, even in the middle of a global conflict. The psychological weight of the revelation changed the way we looked at the Pacific War, adding a layer of mystery and tragedy to an already complex and bloody history of the sea. We saw the commanders of the Archerfish honored for their kill, and we realized that our secret was the highlight of their lives, just as it was the defining trauma of our own. The fascination of the encounter is the perfect symmetry of the hunt. The largest ship ever built, stopped by one of the smallest and most hidden of the enemy's silent weapons. It was a climax that felt scripted by fate, a final act for the Imperial Japanese Navy that was as grand as it was utterly and completely futile. The Shinano was a ghost that finally found its voice, speaking to a world that was now ready to listen to the truth of the dark. The psychological weight of the secret flaw in our survival is the question of why we were spared, while the giant was taken by the sea and the dark. The fascination of the survivor's guilt is a shadow that follows us into the quiet years of our old age, a whisper of the oil and the salt in the middle of the night. We see the faces of the young recruits who never made it to the destroyers, their eyes full of a loyalty that the ship could not return to them in the end. The fascination of the Shinano is their story, the story of the men who worked in the dark to keep a dream alive while the ocean was already at their very throats. We are the keepers of their names, the ones who must ensure that the largest ghost is remembered as a human tragedy, and not just a cold and technical naval statistic. The ship was a tomb, but it was also a home for 1,000 souls, and the weight of that responsibility is a burden we carry with a grim and silent pride. The giant is silent now, but her memory is a roaring tide that never truly recedes from the shores of our tired and heavy minds. I often think about the secret flaw of the deep-sea explorations that seek to find the Shinano, a search for a secret that the ocean has guarded for over 80 long years. The fascination of the hunt for the wreck is a continuation of the mystery, a desire to touch the steel and see the damage that the Archerfish inflicted in the dark. The psychological weight of the wreck's location, miles deep in the Kumano Sea, is a barrier that keeps the giant isolated from the prying eyes of the modern and digital world. We hope she is never found, that her secrets remain buried in the silt and the darkness where she can finally be at peace and away from the war. The fascination of her invisibility is her most enduring characteristic, a ship that was born in shadows and chose to return to them at the first opportunity she was given. The Shinano is a legend because she is hidden, a ghost that lives in the imagination of every sailor who has ever wondered what lies at the very bottom of the vast blue. She is the queen of the abyss, a monument to a time of iron and fire that is slowly fading into the mists of the long ago. The fascination with the secret flaw of the conversion is that it created a ship that was neither a battleship nor a carrier, but a confused and vulnerable hybrid of two different eras. The psychological weight of that compromise was the reason she sank, a lesson in the dangers of trying to force a machine to be something it was never designed to be. We see the same mistakes being made in the world today, the rush to adapt and the failure to consider the structural integrity of the human and the mechanical. The fascination of the Shinano is its relevance, a story of haste and secrecy that echoes through the halls of every shipyard and every boardroom in the modern age. We were the victims of that haste, the men who had to live with the consequences of a design that was flawed from the very moment of its hurried and secret conception. The ship was a ghost before she was ever launched, a vessel that was haunted by the impossibility of her own existence and the weight of her own massive and heavy steel. I remember the secret flaw of the final salute we gave to the sea on the anniversary of the sinking, a quiet ritual performed by a dwindling number of old and gray-haired men. The fascination of the ceremony was its simplicity, a few flowers tossed into the waves and a silent prayer for the brothers who stayed with the giant in the deep. The psychological weight of the memory is a bridge to a past that feels more real than the present, a world of salt and oil and the roar of the boilers in the dark. We feel the presence of the Shinano in the movement of the tides, a reminder that she is still there, waiting for the end of time to reveal her final and total and absolute secret. The fascination of the survivor is the ability to see the world differently, to know the fragility of the massive and the power of the small and the hidden and the silent. We were the crew of the world's largest ghost, and our watch will only end when the last of us returns to the sea to join the giant in her rest. The psychological weight of the secret flaw in our history books is that they often skip over the Shinano, preferring to focus on the battles of Leyte Gulf or the firebombing of the cities. The fascination of her anonymity is a gift, a way for the ship to remain ours, a private tragedy that belongs only to the men who walked her vast and unfinished and cold and gray decks. We don't need the world to understand the scale of the loss. We only need the sea to remember the weight of the steel and the silence of the final and fatal roll. The fascination of the carrier is her mystery, a story that grows more haunting with every year that passes without a single photograph of her on the surface of the deep. She is the shadow of the Yamato, the forgotten sister of the Musashi, and the most tragic secret of the Imperial Japanese Navy's final, and desperate, and dark, and cold, and silent end. The Shinano is a ghost, and we are the haunted, and the story of our 10 days together is a flame that will burn in the dark forever. The fascination with the secret flaw of the ocean's depth is that it preserves the ship in a state of eternal and freezing and silent and dark and absolute perfection for the rest of all time. The psychological weight of the pressure at those depths is a physical fact that keeps the secrets of the Shinano safe from the light in the air and the noise of the living. We imagine her there, her flight deck still holding the shadow of the Hinomaru, her engines still waiting for the command that will never come from the bridge again. The fascination of her state is her peace, a quiet that she earned through the trauma of her 10-day life and her violent and sudden and tragic and lonely and silent and dark death. We are the last ones who can still feel the vibration of her heart, the ones who know that she was real, even if the world insists she was just a ghost in the sea. The Shinano was our ship, our secret, and our tragedy, and she will sail on in the darkness of the Pacific as long as the world continues to turn. If the haunting and tragic story of the IJN Shinano and the Archerfish has captured your imagination, please consider subscribing for more deep-sea secrets and naval mysteries from the past. We are dedicated to telling the stories of the ships that the world forgot, and the men who lived in the shadows of the most colossal and tragic naval failures. The fascination with the largest ghost ship is a tribute to the human cost of war and the incredible and silent power of the deep and dark and cold and salty ocean. Comment below. Do you believe the Shinano could have changed the war if she had been finished? Or was she always a ghost destined to vanish into the deep? Share this story of secrecy and tragedy to help us keep the memory of the grand old lady of Yokosuka alive for a new and curious generation of history seekers. Your support allows us to explore the secret flaws of history and bring the silent terrors of the deep back into the light of the modern and busy and noisy and living world.